Let me now introduce our very, very distinguished speaker for tonight. I was very, very fortunate to visit the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine last October. I had a dear friend, Professor Shushin, who has been scholar of many areas, but the Chinese Jews in particular, and he was giving a lecture in this center and invited me to go there. That lecture, and in Maine, I was honored and I heard the greatest lecture by Mr. Katz, who you will hear, and he presented a documentary that I thought would be very beneficial to our community, and we would all learn a lot about Holocaust, how it started, and the result of that, and hopefully will teach us how to avoid the same situation possibly anywhere in the world. So with that introduction, with that feeling, I politely approached Mr. Katz. I expressed to him my great interest and thank you for his work. And I begged him to come and give his lecture to you and your group. And ladies and gentlemen, here is Mr. Katz himself to present his life, his history, how we got to this situation, and how this documentary was all about. Please welcome Mr. Katz.
Thank you very much. It's a bit intimidating when you say it was the greatest lecture. I need to remind my students that. It's a delight to be here. And I left Maine this morning, and we were in the midst of winter. And I arrived in Vermont, and it's spring. So thank you very much.
Don't blink.
The project that I'm going to speak about today is a project called Where the House Still Standing. And it was created for the Michael Clark Center, which is the permanent home of the Holocaust and Human Rights Center of Maine. We're an independent nonprofit organization located on the campus of the University of Maine. Although we're not affiliated with the university, they just gave us the land to build the center. In about 2004, when we began discussing the possibilities of having a beautiful new building, the question arose, what is going to be in the building? We primarily serve as an educational resource for high school students and college students. So of course we needed classrooms and a kitchen and bathrooms, but what else was going to be in the building? Because we were determined that we were not going to create a Holocaust museum. So we are not into preserving and exhibiting artifacts. We realized that the most precious resource that we did have, however, was the testimony of a handful of people who witnessed the Holocaust and who eventually settled and raised their families in the state of Maine. We had spent about 12 years collecting this oral testimony. We had well over 100 hours, and we decided that somehow this is what we wanted to exhibit and preserve. The problem was that over these 12 years, most of the recordings were done under very poor, primitive conditions. So the first year of the project, we were involved in what's called forensic restoration, which we were basically in a computer lab, just trying to get the testimony to a point that it would be audible. Then the second problem was, what do we do with over 100 hours of testimony? It was just too cumbersome for most students to sit through. I mean, there were researchers who wanted to hear all of it, but it was really inaccessible. So my job was to somehow weave together all of this testimony into a cohesive story. And story is the key word, because as we know, there are numerous ways to understand past events. A good resource, of course, are historians. But I'm not a historian, I'm a storyteller. And so we understood the value of stories. And stories, of course, are imperfect. Oftentimes, the narrator might embellish events. They might not share certain stories because they might be embarrassed or they were too painful. And we understood the imperfections of the narrative, but we felt, nevertheless, we were going to keep all of that because there was a value in the story itself. And it was just giving a different perspective of how to understand these horrific events. So I spent about 4 years of my life pretty much cleaning everything off of my table and just focusing in on working on this project with a team of designers and filmmakers from all over the country. But before I present to you the excerpts of this project, I would like to share with you my story and why this project had such deep meaning for me. So my story begins in New York in the 1950s, and with a man whose name was Louis Foreman. My mother called him by his Yiddish name, Leibish, and I called him my grandfather Lee. What I remember about my grandfather was that he spoke about 5 different languages fluently. He spoke Russian, Polish, German, Hebrew, Yiddish, and he struggled most with his English. We knew he wasn't from this country, and whenever we would ask him to tell us about where he came from, he would only refer to that place as the old world. No other details. And then he would always turn away from us, and he would spit on the ground. And that action of spitting, my impression was it was out of disgust and anger, and it was just a gut reaction to his memories. So he never shared with us any details of his life, and oftentimes when we asked him, we would notice that tears would swell up in his eyes. It was just too painful for him to talk about. Now, this part of the story is going to sound odd, and it was only recently that I think I understood the significance of it. At some point in my grandfather's life, he lost all of his teeth. And we don't know the circumstances of when or where he lost his teeth. And the teeth that he had in his mouth never fit him properly. And it was very difficult for him to eat with these teeth that were just clattering around in his mouth. So whenever he would come over to our house for Shabbat dinner, it was almost a choreographed move. He would take his hand, move it across his face, and dislodge his teeth and place them in a glass of water next to him. As a small boy, I was mesmerized. I couldn't understand how anybody could take their teeth out of their mouth. And I would watch his teeth slowly sink to the bottom of the jar, enlarged in the optics of the glass. But my mother hated when he did this. And she would scream across the table, "Leibish, Leibish, get your dirty teeth off of the table. They're disgusting to look at." So he would reach into the glass, pull his teeth out, wrap them in a dirty napkin, and put it in his lap. Well, the dog knew the routine. So the dog, of course, and this was a dance that we did every Friday night, and the dog would run over to his lap, grab the dirty napkin, and run off with it. Now, for reasons that I will never understand, it didn't matter how many kids were sitting around the table, my grandfather would look over to me. He never said anything. He would just give me this look. And I understood the look. And the look was, get down on your hands and knees, find the dog, and bring me back my teeth. Which I did for years and years and years. So, I must have been around 14. And my grandfather was on the Silver Bullet, which was a train that went from New York to Florida, and it derailed, and he was thrown from the train, and he never recovered. And about 2 weeks before he passed away, he called me over to his bedside, and he said, "I want to give you something." And what he gave me was a pile of envelopes. And he said, "I'm giving you this because I know you collect stamps, and there are stamps from all over the world. You might be interested in it." And at this point in my life, I really wasn't collecting stamps anymore, so I made a fateful decision. Instead of throwing out these meaningless envelopes, there were no letters in them, they were just envelopes, I took the bundle, took it down into the basement, put it in a trunk to be forgotten about. He passed away, I grew up, I went to college in New York, and then I decided I was going to move out west, because my dream was to become a cowboy. To the chagrin of my parents, why did he send me to college? Anyway, so the problem was growing up in Brooklyn, there were no cattle, there were no cowboys, and I plotted the strategy that the day I graduated, I would head out to Montana, which I did, and I settled down in Montana. During my many years living in Montana, I ended up moving onto the Crow Indian Reservation, where I was working for the tribe in the area of Indian education. And I lived in a log cabin down a dirt road along the banks of the Little Bighorn River. And late one night, I heard a pickup truck racing down my driveway, which was unusual. All of a sudden, there was a pounding on my door. When I opened it, there were about a half a dozen men from the tribe. They all were packing 30-06 rifles, and they told me to get dressed, and I'm coming with them. It really wasn't the moment to argue with them. And so, threw on my jeans and my boots, and I jumped into the back of the pickup, and I had no idea where they were taking me. We got to the end of the road, and I mustered up the courage to say, well, what are you going to do with me? And they said, we're taking you on a buffalo hunt. And these were men who were very proficient hunters, and the elders of the tribe asked these men to go up into the mountains and harvest the buffalo for a traditional feast that was taking place down in the village. And this was an honor. Because of the work I was doing on the reservation, they had invited me to go on this hunt. And it must have been about 2 in the morning, and we climbed to the top of one of the ridges in the Bighorn Mountains, and they made a campfire, and they sat around the fire, and something extraordinary happened. On the Northern Plains tribes, the Crow, the Sioux, the Blackfeet, they have what's called an oral culture, meaning that they have never had a written language. So storytelling is critical to sustaining the traditions and the history of the tribe. It's everybody's responsibility, every tribal member's responsibility, from the time they're little kids to listen carefully to the stories, remember the stories, and pass the stories on. And so we were sitting around the campfire, and I was hearing just incredible stories about buffalo hunts and intertribal warfare and the day that George Custer rolled into town. And it sounded like these events just happened last week, and in some cases, these were stories from over 100 years ago. And I was mesmerized by the detail of these narratives, and we went around the circle, and then they came to me. Well, all of these men had names that were related to animals. There was Old Coyote and Yellowtail, and when they came to me, they never heard of a Jewish name, so they always referred to me as Bobcat. And they would say, Bobcat, you tell us your story. And I sat there. And I sat there in silence. And I think it was at that moment that the weight of the Holocaust came crashing into my consciousness as I was sitting on this mountaintop in Montana with a group of Native Americans going on a buffalo hunt. It was the Holocaust that made me realize that this is why I had no story to pass on to my ancestors, to pass on to my children. And when I came down from the mountain, I promised myself, if there was any way that I could find my story, this was going to become a priority in my life. And so that winter, I drove back to New York to spend the holidays with my parents, and we were sitting around the dining room table, and I was telling them this, and I remembered the letters. Wow. I ran down to the basement, opened the trunk, and there they were, untouched for 10 years. And so I began writing all the people whose names were on the front of these envelopes, explaining who I was and who my grandfather was, And I said, if you know anything about what happened to our family, please get in touch with me. It took 2 years before I got the first of 2 responses. And I would just like to read you an excerpt from that first letter. So, dear Robert, your family came from Galicia, Poland. There were many scholars and a pack of characters right out of the paintings of our beloved Chagall. All from Austria, Poland, not far from Lemberg. They were, of course, all victims of economic oppression and had very little chance. But as you and I and others seem to indicate, the seeds of ethnic creativity was well planted in the family organism. As for your request about the remaining members of the family, there was time and the river, or at least Hitler and Auschwitz. When the German tanks rolled into the small villages and towns of Galicia, the Jews, young and strong, became fodder for their factories, or if inept, old, or too young, went directly to the gas chambers. The vast majority of our family were fed to the flames. We are a long way from the ghetto villages of our ancestors, but we did not lose the quality that expired there. So now, for the first time in my life, I had a place, I had a destination, this place called Galicia. And now the question was, how to get there? It was 1989, and if any of you remember what was happening in 1989, it was the fall of communism, and the Soviet troops were pulling out of Eastern Europe. And what few people know is that the Soviets actually created a wall along the entire boundary of Europe. And it ran through Romania, Poland, up into Slovakia. And it was mined, and they had machine gun posts. And Stalin depopulated this region in the Carpathian Mountains. And for 50 years, nobody was allowed to enter this mountain range, except for a group of elite communist hunters. And so as the Soviet troops were leaving Poland, a group of young wildlife biologists from the Polish Academy of Science and Jagiellonian University organized an expedition to go into these mountains just to see what was there, because it had been untouched for 50 years. And I read an article about this expedition, and I contacted them, and for reasons I don't know, they invited me to join them. So I ended up in Krakow, Poland in March of '89 and joined this expedition. And what we ended up discovering, and I don't want to get too sidetracked, but we ended up discovering every major big game species of animal that ever roamed Europe was alive and well in this mountain range. We discovered the red deer, which is like the American elk, the roe deer, which stands about 1.5 feet high. We found a rare species of brown bear and lynx. The most aggressive animals we found, of course, were the wild boar that treat us many, many times. But the most extraordinary discovery is we found the largest pack of wolves still thriving in Europe today, because the wolves thrived during the war from all the carcasses that were left behind. And then for 50 years, nobody was hunting them. And so I became part of this expedition. You know, how does this tie into the story? And we would hike like 20 miles a day, and we were collecting various data to understand the dynamic of the wolf herds, the wolf packs. And I realized that these young biologists were mostly in their 30s. They were young PhD students, which meant that they were born after the war, which also meant they had never met a Jew. And it took me a while to reveal to them who I was and why I was really in Poland. That it really wasn't because of the wolves, it was because of other things. Well, it turned out they were fascinated with the fact that I was Jewish. And they wanted to know everything I could share with them about Judaism. And so we were on these ridiculously strenuous hikes all day long on the trail of wolves, and they just constantly were questioning me about every aspect of Judaism that I could share with them. They were really, really interested because they knew nothing about it. And as you know, that when the communists began to dominate Eastern Europe, they pretty much wrote out of history the story of the Jews. I mean, even when you went to places like Auschwitz and Treblinka, you never saw the word Jew mentioned. It was just, people were murdered here, citizens were murdered here, never the word Jew. So they knew nothing about Judaism. And then I eventually told them why I was really there and how I was searching for my family. And one of the biologists, his name was Roman Gula, and he finally said to me, we're going to help you. We're going to help you find your village and find your story. And it was about now 5 years later. And I would go back to Poland every year. And it was about 5 years that I got a call late one night from Poland. And he said, Bob, you need to come back right away. We think we found your village. And I arrived in Poland, and we traveled up the border of the Ukraine. And we ended up in a small village called Chechanov. And he said, we're pretty sure this is where your grandfather came from. And there was a small house, which was sort of like the city hall. And we went in there, and I remember there was just a desk with a bare light bulb hanging over the desk, and a woman who didn't seem to be doing anything, but she kept us waiting for about an hour before she could talk to us. And then when she finally allowed us to come into the room, and I explained to her why I was there, she just yelled at me and said, yeah, get out of here. We know nothing about the Jews. When the Nazis came into town, they burned all the records, and I can't help you. And at that point, I felt the story was at an end. But what I didn't notice was in the room next door, there was a woman on her hands and knees scrubbing the floor, overhearing the conversation. And as I was leaving the building, she ran to the window and she screamed at us, go to the cemetery, find the cemetery. Of course, because if I was able to find the cemetery, the Jewish cemetery, I would find the headstones of my ancestors if this is where they really came. And on the outskirts of town, we saw a high stone wall. And I remember Roman walked over to the wall and he said, Bob, climb up on my shoulders, jump over, and see what you could find. Which I did. I jumped over the wall, and I stood up, and there was nothing. Of course there was nothing. Because the first thing the Nazis did when they rolled into these villages was to rip the headstones off the graves and pave the streets with them. So I'm not quite sure why she told me to go there. But as I was leaving, I heard the clanging of a gate. And an elderly lady, she stood about that high with a hunched back and a cane, and she was yelling at me. Why are you here? Why are you here? Nobody comes to this place. And as she approached me, I pulled out this small photograph I carried with me of my grandfather and grandmother. And I showed it to her. And she took it from me and just stared at it. And she just stared at it. And then she motioned us to follow her. And she led us into the village. And she began pounding on the doors of all the elderly people in the village, and they all congregated on the street, and they began speaking very, very agitated, quick Polish. We could hardly understand them, and all of a sudden I heard a name, the name Nuchem. And I thought about that, because Nuchem is my name. In the Hebrew tradition, you're given a Hebrew name after an ancestor that has passed away. But nobody in Poland knew my Hebrew name. And I realized they weren't talking about me, they were talking about my uncle. And it was at that moment that I realized that I had found my story. And the people then took me through the village, and they showed me the home that my grandfather and great-grandfather lived in. They told me an extraordinary story of that when the Nazis came into town, they actually set up their headquarters in the house that my great-grandfather owned. And one of the first things they did is they put forth an edict that organized prayer would not be allowed. And that if anybody was caught at a Sabbath ceremony or religious prayers during the high holidays, they would immediately be shot. And during the holidays, they would send out parties to sort of search the root cellars and search the countryside for illicit prayer meetings. And so what did my great-grandfather do? He invited people into his home, and he had them pray in a room right next to the Nazi headquarters, the one place that they wouldn't look, right under their noses. And I thought, what a wonderful, courageous story to have part of my heritage. Anyway, so the story was complete. I learned all about the family and some details about what happened to the Jews when the Nazis came into town. And when my daughter turned 13, I took her and my mother back to the village, so we connected 4 generations, and it was really quite remarkable. And then I became immersed in this project because it had more meaning for me now to preserve these stories that needed to be shared. I was 2 years into the project, and the second letter arrived. Now, this is like 30, 40 years after I wrote these letters. When I wrote these letters, computers didn't exist. I never saw a computer. The second letter arrived as an email. And I'm always accused of being a compulsive deleter. And this was the first moment in this whole journey that I really felt divine intervention. Because if I don't recognize a person's name, I don't bother, I just delete it. And my hand was going down to the delete button and something stopped. And I said, maybe I should read this. And what it said was, you don't know me. I just did a Google search, and I am emailing this information to every Robert Katz that came up on my Google search. And there are quite a few. And he began telling me that an uncle of his had recently passed away, and he went through his papers, and he found an old letter from a boy by the name of Robert Katz, looking for his ancestors. Also, in this box of treasures, he found a movie that was shot in Poland in 1938, in this village, and he believed that the people in this film were all of my ancestors. Well, that was just too unbelievable. And he gave me the name of the person that was now in possession of this film. And he was an elderly man, and I kept calling and calling, and he never picked up the phone. And my daughter came home from college that weekend, and I said, sweetie, I have a deal that you can't refuse. I'm going to buy you and your boyfriend a ticket to New York City. Go to the Upper West Side, go to this address, knock on the door, explain to them who you are, take this photograph with you, and ask the person who answers the door if they are in possession of an old film that was shot in Europe. And 2 days later, she was back in Maine. She said, here, Dad, here's a package. And I ran, I got a 16mm projector, and there was nothing. And there was my great-grandfather and my great-grandmother, and there was the entire family. And you could tell that they had never seen a movie projected before. They didn't know how to act in front of the camera. They were smiling, and they were very pious. They had their big beards and their hats, and there was an image of my great-grandmother coming out of her house with a whole bundle of vegetables. She must have been in the middle of making chicken soup. And there they all were. And never in my imagination, when I was sitting on that mountaintop in Montana, did I ever think that I would actually ever see them. And then there was the last scene. And the last scene, the person who shot the film was at a railroad station outside of the village. And I kept watching this over and over again, and then all of a sudden, I saw the name of the railroad station. Belzec.
What?
Belzec. Belzec became an infamous death camp 2 years later. And that's where everybody in the movie perished. So the story had a beginning and an end. And that's what led me to work on this project that I'm going to share with you today. And then after the project is over, if there are any questions, I'd be glad to answer them. So, okay, so we could start the film.
Het is me ten ene male onmogelijk alles op te bouwen op de basis van dood, ellende en verwarring. Ik zie hoe de wereld langzaam steeds meer in een woestijn herschapen wordt. Ik hoor steeds harder de aanrollende donder, die ook ons zal doden. Ik voel het leed van miljoenen mensen mee.
I thought the use of sound was very powerful. And also I really loved that little bit at the bottom where it was kind of a montage or whatever. And I thought that was like a really nice anchor to your emotion somehow. So I love that. I guess my question is, how has going back to Poland kind of healed just being in the land?
Well, a couple of things that you really didn't experience in this presentation. That this really isn't a movie. It's an installation. So, and a room was built at the Holocaust Center to house this project. It's a round room about 33 feet in diameter. We have, I think, 16 speakers built into the ceiling and the floor and the walls. So we have had survivors come and watch this for the second time and say that they watched it actually with their eyes closed, and they just listened for the sound. Because what you hear is you hear the train actually moving across the room. At Kristallnacht, and you hear the broken glass. You're jarred from your seat because you hear the glass breaking all around you. The sound, the acoustics was very, very important. We spent a year in Poland collecting all of the sounds. So you're listening to because when we study the Holocaust, we're so used to understanding it through static black and white photographs. But the Holocaust was in color, it had sound, it had smells. And so all of the sounds were authentic. I mean, we recorded the trains on the tracks that were used during the Holocaust. All of the birds and the crickets were recorded in the cemeteries in the mountains of Poland. You might have caught it. There was one moment where there was nothing on the screen and you just heard words being spoken.
Nazwisko moje, Tadeusz Jakubowicz. Jestem przewodniczący gminy Znaniowej Żydowskiej.
Boris. And those were the names of victims being read in Polish and in German and in Russian. So yes, the soundscape was very, very important. And I worked with an extraordinary acoustic designer from Syracuse University who accumulated and gathered all of these sounds. The installation actually runs 75 minutes. And you just saw about 40 minutes here. There are instances where we actually found footage of some of the bombardments that were taking place. And we actually went to the army and we were able to record the ordinances that were being used. So the accuracy of the sound was very, very critical for the piece. The bottom screen, which is actually a screen that is on the floor in the room. So you see the river flowing basically through your feet, was sort of my poetic metaphor of the journey. It began with the winter runoff. And then the railroad tracks, that was the shadow of myself walking the tracks from where the trains emptied the people at Birkenau and the length of time it would take you to enter the gas chamber. So that was the remaining time that you had to live, basically. And then when that ends, of course, there's the liberation and the bells, and then you have the spring runoff. So it begins on a river and it ends on a river. And you're asking me about the healing. I didn't go to Poland to heal. For me, there's nothing in Poland that is healing. You see anti-Semitism all over in Poland. I mean, the remaining cemeteries are often defaced. Even outside of Majdanek and some of the other death camps, you would see graffiti on the walls of gallows with the Star of David hanging from it. I mean, there are certainly good people in Poland, you know. I mean, the people that helped me find my story were absolutely wonderful people. But for me, there was nothing healing about the experience. It was just sort of discovering and confronting the truth of what happened and trying to understand why my grandfather always spit on the ground when he thought of his life back then. We also try to depict at the beginning, the way the film is constructed is that people talk about their lives. And the important thing for those people who are teaching the Holocaust and to understand it, these were normal, average people, just like you and me. And they talk about, you know, the cleanliness of their home and the smell of their mother's food. And
I remember my mother's, the house where I grew up. And it's maybe funny, but the most what I remember is the smell of a very clean house.
Longer film, they talk about their sledding down the hills. Life was normal. They were living exactly the lives you were living. And all of a sudden, things began to change, of course, as we know. And anti-Semitism began rising its ugly face. And then, of course, the Holocaust. And then, you know, they talk about, in the full film, more about trying to reconstruct their lives and how difficult it was. And I don't think the survivors ever healed from the experience. They just learned to live with it and rebuild their lives and move on. And then, of course, it's so profound to hear the words of Elie Wiesel at the end and to read the papers and see what's going on today in the world. We have told our story, and the world remains the same. And what will it take? I mean, how many, you know, mosques need to be? There need to be slaughters in mosques and in synagogues. And what will it take to change mankind? That's the million-dollar question. Yeah, yes.
I'm curious. First of all, thank you. I thought that was profoundly moving. I really appreciate that you put that together. And I'm curious, not only in this installation, but everything I've seen, the photographic evidence of the Holocaust, I've always wondered where that came from. You know, I'm sure that the perpetrators did not want any of that. And I'm wondering how much came from the liberators and you know, what other sources there were for the archival footage that you used and what's out there.
That's a really good question. The Germans took lots of photographs. In fact, there are exhibitions of photographs taken by the German guards in the various death camps. So the evidence taken by the Germans is quite accessible. And then, of course, we one of the interesting side stories to this project is I was working with a transcriber, and in the back of the room was a secretary listening to the conversation. And she said, "Are you guys talking about the Holocaust?" And I said, "Well, yes." And she said, "Well, just the other night, my mother took out a photo album from my father, who was in the war, and I believe they were looking at photographs of one of the death camps." And I said I would really like to see it. And they lived always out in the countryside in a trailer, and I had to maneuver through a pack of Doberman pinchers to get into the house. And there were rifles hanging all over the walls. And she opened up this album, and the letter and the story of Joe Poulin was her father.
April 12th, 1945. Hi, sweetheart. Received your letter yesterday and sure was glad to hear from you. In fact, I spent all night dreaming about you and how nice it would be to take you in my arms again. Those beautiful lips of yours tormented me too. Wish I could plant a good smacker on them once more. Well, Norma, I saw a sight yesterday that was something out of this world and can hardly be believed without seeing it. I'll try to describe it to you, but it won't be anything like what we saw, because you just can't put it into words.
And so that information and those photographs no one had ever seen about the lime pit and about the liberation of that camp. So there's still a lot of information out there that the public has not gained access to yet. But people were taking pictures, lots of pictures.
Let's have one more question. It's getting late. And our
Yes.
guest has not had dinner yet.
No, it's okay. It's
We
okay.
have to go ahead.
I just
Okay.
want to say thank you, first of all, for making the film. I think hearing the voices of the survivors are so important. And I would guess that probably many of these survivors are not still with us.
That's right.
And so it becomes even more important to document them, and also that they're local. I mean,
Yes.
to you in Maine, I think sometimes we think that the Holocaust is so long ago and so far away, but we often have neighbors that we don't know are connected in some way, and that brings it home. And my question is actually about the title of the film. Where did that come from?
Well, a couple of things that you noticed. Yes, it was very important for us. The film was made mostly for students to introduce them to the story of the Holocaust. And yes, this is only the story of 16 people who happened to settle in the state of Maine. And that's why there are many aspects of the Holocaust story that is not being revealed here, because either they didn't share it with us or they didn't experience it. And so the common thread is that these were, yes, our neighbors. And that's why we began their narrative by showing them in their home, opening up their door, pruning their garden, because we wanted to normalize them.
As I get older, I feel that I have lost so much, not in material things, because all of those can be replaced, but in human lives and family. There is no family left except the family we created. All of this happened so many, many years ago that by now I should be able to talk about it somewhat detached, but that is not the case. As a matter of fact, I find it more and more difficult.
Because we wanted to normalize them and say these could be the people who are living right next to you right now. Word of the House Still Standing comes from a part of a text in a Jewish prayer, and we used it because it opens up a question. What house are we referring to? And that's a question that everybody here could answer. And were the house still standing? If it was still standing, how would the world be different? So we felt that it was a title that wasn't sort of giving an answer, but opening up questions and reflection about this experience.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for coming.